Hello friends, or maybe I should say good evening sleepyheads. I'm Thomas Waters and welcome to my video series on revolutions and the making of the modern world. This series is about the history of revolutions over the past 2.5 centuries. Today, I won't be talking about political revolutions, about heady schemes for seizing power and remaking society. Instead, I'll be discussing revolutions in the secondary, wider sense of the word, as fundamental economic, social and cultural changes. Specifically, I want to explore a relatively new and I think very engaging topic of historical research. It contains pretty profound changes at the level of daily, or maybe I should say nightly, life. Though I must admit that my personal interest in this subject is perhaps pushing me to make it a candidate for a social and cultural revolution. At any rate, the topic for this week's video is the history of nighttime, and more particularly the history of sleep. That's right, the history of sleep. Some of you may be puzzled by the idea that slumber could have a history. Is sleep not a basic biological function and unchanging historical constant? Didn't our forebears and ancestors enjoy or endure sleep in essentially the same ways as we do today? Well, probably not. It seems that, in fact, for much of human history and throughout much, though not all of the world, people took their nighttime rest in two segments. In the academic literature on sleep, this is called the biphasic or bimodal model. But in the talk and chatter of the past, our predecessors often spoke about first and second sleeps. Now, it may well be, as I've seen some classicists complain, that Roger Ekirch, one of the great pioneers of sleep history, was mistaken in interpreting the phrase first sleep in a translation of Homer's Odyssey as a genuine reference to the phenomenon of bimodal sleep. But even if that particular example is in error, the generalization still stands. Talk of first and second sleeps was commonplace in the past. These were well known, widely used and pretty much universally understood phrases in the Victorian era and earlier. A quick look through the British Newspaper Archive, a magnificent digital source, flags up numerous 19th century references to first and second sleeps, and quite a few from the early 20th century too, though the phenomenon was noticeably in decline by that era. Ellen Gladys Glasspool, daughter of the deceased, stated that she awoke from a second sleep about 9:30 on the morning of September 13th, reads a pretty typical reference in a 1940 edition of the Bognor Regis Observer from England's south coast. Interestingly, in Ireland, newspaper references to turning over for a second sleep, meaning having a morning lie-in, a proper rest at the weekend, or at least not getting up at the crack of dawn, these continued throughout the 20th century, remaining pretty common into the 1990s and beyond. This is not to say that Irish sleeping patterns during this latter period remained fundamentally biphasic or pre-modern, since the term second sleep seems to carry related but different connotations to the meaning it had during the early modern period of the 16th and 17th centuries. But the fact that the term second sleep was still widely used and understood in 20th century Ireland should, I think, be taken as a linguistic echo, trace or clue of the fact that our ancestors slept quite differently to ourselves. In the pre-modern world, the first sleep was proverbially longer, at perhaps 4 or 5 hours, as well as stiller, sounder, quieter and deeper. In proverbs and stories, it was during people's first sleeps that they were robbed or betrayed without waking to notice. But assuming the worst didn't happen, what was supposed to follow the first sleep was a period of relaxed, quiet and restful wakefulness. An hour or two at most, but more likely less, perhaps in candlelight, firelight or moonlight, or maybe just in darkness. Time to read, pray, think, zone out, imagine, scheme, listen, plan, fall into your beloved's arms maybe, or tell tales. Oh my sister, relate to us a story to beguile the waking hour of our night, as it says in the introductory frame story to my rather stuffy 19th century translation of the 1001 Nights, which is often known as Arabian Nights. The literary depictions of a deep first sleep, followed by a pleasantly relaxed, wakeful interlude, match up with the thrust of much sleep science. For example, sleep experiments have found that during periods of restful wakefulness, between a first and second sleep, participants are under a heightened influence of prolactin, the pituitary hormone that allows chickens to contentedly brood on their eggs for long periods of time. Historically, the second sleep was notorious for being lighter, less satisfying, and sometimes exhausting or even terrifying That was because it was more prone to vivid imaginings, dreams, and nightmares. In novels like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, it was during their second sleeps that characters were haunted by a terrible dream. In the real world too, the idea that during second sleeps people were more likely to dream was widely recognised in medical manuals, dream books, theological works, and all sorts of other literature. And to be fair, this seems to match up with a basic finding of sleep science that lighter phases in the sleep cycle are more prone to rapid eye movement or REM and therefore dreams. The notion that many people in the pre-modern past slept in a bimodal or biphasic way has received quite a lot of pushback, not just from historians, but from anthropologists, sleep scientists, and others. That's to be expected when arguments are made for a hitherto unnoticed, but seemingly pervasive and distinctive feature of the past. Attempts to refute, qualify, or more fundamentally alter the theory or thesis are also very welcome, since it's through these kinds of disputes that knowledge advances. But despite all of this, I think some recent riposts to the theory of biphasic sleep have had their significance overstated. Because today, a tribal people or society who live largely without electric lighting do not slumber in two phases does not mean that our ancestors didn't. To prove the wider point that people in the past didn't sleep in two phases, you'll need to provide an alternative and more plausible interpretation of the thousands of references to first and second sleep, which crop up in all manner of pre-20th century written sources, as if the meaning of those terms were common knowledge. Needless to say, no plausible alternative explanation has yet been provided. Recent work on the anthropology of sleep is, however, helpful when it comes to questions of causality. That is, this work helps us to better puzzle out why our predecessors began sleeping in one big, roughly 7 or 8 hour block, rather than in two shorter phases, one deep, the other dreamy. In history, I think it's generally true that causal questions are the hardest of all, that it's typically more difficult to explain why something happened compared to chronicling what happened. At any rate, that's certainly true when it comes to the history of sleep. Causes proposed for the disappearance of biphasic sleep patterns include early rising movements, which exhorted people to make better use of the day than lying in bed, and industrial and consumer capitalism, which didn't have time for people enjoying periods of restful repose. Condensing sleep into a single segment was certainly more time efficient, leaving more hours for work and for pleasure. A third explanation for the extension of the first sleep and decline of the second sleep is related to the invention and uptake of artificial electric lighting. This took place in the Western world roughly around the time of the Second Industrial Revolution during the early 20th century. The advantage of this causal explanation is that it accords somewhat with what we know about the biology of sleep. Exposure to artificial electric light, whether from the filament bulbs of the past or the LED lights and computer and phone screens of today, ultimately suppresses the production of the hormone melatonin, which helps to induce sleep. It's beginning to sound plausible, yet the discovery by anthropologists that some people who don't much use electric lights also sleep in single prolonged segments underlines the power of culture as well as technology in shaping our sleeping habits. The importance of illumination to how we organise our lives touches on a final point I'd like to make about the history of night going beyond the history of sleep. Before the invention and popularisation of electric lighting, there were of course numerous forms of less effective illumination: open fires, flaming torches, lamps lit with everything from olive oil to paraffin, and candles made from substances as diverse as tallow, which is animal fat, whale blubber, or beeswax for the rich. Yet, before the onset of public and private electric lighting, and after in a few cases, moonlight was an absolutely vital form of nocturnal illumination, which people from all backgrounds understood and paid close attention to. We can see this in the way that, in historical novels and in reality, people planned journeys according to the light and phases of the moon. This habit is also reflected in the fact that almanacs, one of the most popular forms of literature before the 20th century, contain this information in the form of daily lunar calendars. Our forebears' much more complete and intricate knowledge of moonlight is also reflected in their artistic output. In his plays and poems, Shakespeare mentioned the moon over 150 times. Thomas Hardy, in his novels and verses, referred to it on over 300 occasions, describing not just waning, gibbous, and third quarter and nearly full moons, but also moons of varying sizes and colours and brightnesses: old gold, bright, silvery, white-faced, orange-hued, red, and stained. You may think I'm just being picturesque here, but there might be a lesson for us, albeit a humble one, in our ancestors' use of moonlight. It's not going to single-handedly solve our overuse of energy problems, but in some places, at times when the moon is high and bright, is it beyond the realms of possibility that we could simultaneously dim, if not extinguish, the streetlights? Apparently, some smart streetlights can theoretically already do this, adapting to ambient conditions such as the intensity of moonlight, though from some quick internet searches, I don't believe the technology has yet been rolled out, except in some very select and niche areas, such as the Dutch island of Ameland. It does, however, hold out the possibility both of saving energy and reducing ecologically harmful light pollution. Perhaps in time we'll be able to follow the example of our predecessors by making better use of moonlight.